Good afternoon and welcome to another Research in Action. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Greg O'Crory-Crow. Dr. O'Crory-Crow did his studies at the University at Dublin, Ireland, and then actually ran NOAA's Southwest Fisheries Science Center in La Jolla, California for 14 years. His main interests are in the marine realm, but also evolution of social behavior and mating system in mammals, individual fitness in population viability, adaptation, resilience concepts, which is what he's going to talk about today, and ancient DNA. He's running our only forensic DNA lab here on campus. With that, I want to turn it over to Dr. O'Crory-Crow. Enjoy your presentation.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Let's get right to it, and I look forward to your questions here shortly. So today we're going to talk a little bit about resilience in a time of change, learning to adapt in the Arctic, and why I believe the Arctic is very relevant to a lot of the issues that we will face ourselves throughout the planet. So there's a growing concern over the impact of recent climate change on both Arctic ecosystems and on the native communities that rely upon them. It's a sad twist of fate, I think, that the Arctic, a place that contributes the least to global climate change, in fact, experiences some of the greatest effects. For example, 2020 is on course to be one of the hottest years on record. And to give you an idea, the picture on the right is sort of late spring, typical late spring, early summer, the land of the midnight sun. When I started my research, and the picture on the left is what the same time in the summer is currently. So it's pretty dramatic. So briefly, there are obviously a lot of impacts from warming temperatures, but here are a few of the major issues. We have things like loss of sea ice, thawing of the permafrost, increased frequency of storms, coastal erosion, and also a major increase in a lot of human activities, from shipping to resource development like oil and gas development, and expanding fisheries. And a lot of these changes are impacting a lot of human populations throughout the Arctic, but they're also impacting entire ecosystems and a lot of animal species included in that. So one group of animals I'm particularly interested in are marine mammals. And I think marine mammals to many people are a very iconic species for the Arctic. When you think of the Arctic, I think a lot of people think of polar bears or beluga whales. And marine mammals play a really key role in a lot of Arctic marine ecosystems, you can see here on the left. But they also play an equally important role in the cultures and livelihoods of many native peoples. And they've been doing that essentially for thousands of years and continues to this day. So there is an increasing concern that Arctic marine mammals are particularly vulnerable, I should say, to recent climate change, and especially Arctic whales. So we're going to start to focus in now on the main subject matter of my talk. And I guess I will pose a question: why should we be concerned for Arctic whales? And on one side of the ledger, we have sort of the whales themselves, the biology of these whales, that might make them more vulnerable than other species. They tend to have small population sizes. They are slow reproducers. They don't produce many young in a given year, and very often don't produce young every year, but every second or third year. They are very long-lived, and they have very long generation times. And in general, they're ecological specialists. Even if they have, some of them, diverse diet, they are adapted to sea ice. They're very tightly adapted to certain water temperatures, so they are generally quite specialized in their habits. And they are also creatures of habit, and this is something we're going to spend a lot of time talking about for the rest of the talk. And as a group, obviously, they're quite isolated from other ecosystems, and there's a widespread understanding that they're quite vulnerable to things like disturbance, maybe new diseases, new competitors, new predators. On the other side of the ledger, then we have all these issues that these animals face from the loss of sea ice and changing prey distribution, obviously increasing development and human activities like shipping, disturbance and noise, pollution associated with some of these activities. An emerging threat are obviously new diseases that may occur and arise in the Arctic, but also things like new competitors, new predators. For example, we know killer whales are expanding their range north as the ice disappears. So there's two really important questions here that we're going to try and address, which is, can Arctic whales change course? Can they adapt given this scenario and given their biology? But probably more importantly, can they do it in time? And, you know, they're almost like the proverbial ship, you know, heading towards the iceberg, as it were. And the question is, you know, can they change course rapidly enough? And so this is where we have taken resilience concepts and applied them particularly to what we're studying. And resilience, what I mean here is the long-term capacity of a system to deal with change and continue to develop. And when we think of system, we think of entities with multiple elements. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply, or we are applying the concept of resilience to actually not just ecosystems, as it were, but to individual species. Individual species obviously have multiple elements, multiple individuals. And so I think it's a very appropriate use of this concept. And I would go a step further and say we're applying the concept to individual animals, individuals as it were, and how they are able to deal with change and continue to adapt. There's so many aspects to resilience for species, but today we're going to focus on one, and that is behavior an important element of resilience for the individual and for the species. And now we're going to focus on one particular species, the beluga whale, an intriguing animal, fascinating species, primarily of the far north. And every year we make the pilgrimage, if we can, north to study these animals, to be with these animals, and to work with the communities of people in the far north on beluga whales. So one of the most striking elements of belugas that maybe sets it apart from many other Arctic species is they are highly social. A lot of species I know are highly gregarious, but they are both gregarious and social, and in a spectacular way. I mean, they can form herds in the thousands, and, you know, in terms of biomass, we're talking, you know, that's, you know, 6,000 tons of whale gathering in one location. This has a potentially unique aspect to resilience in that being social, being highly gregarious may have its strengths, its weaknesses, its pros and cons if things are changing. As an example, if animals aggregate in an area where there is a point source of disturbance or pollution or what have you, then potentially a lot of individuals are put at risk. Alternatively, as we will see, maybe being gregarious allows you to learn about things very quickly from your compadres, as it were. So, as I said, belugas are highly social, and we're going to talk about three particular elements of that social behavior today, and see how it feeds into this idea, concept of resilience. One is looking at social structure and kinship, how these societies are structured. Another is looking at social learning, which is kind of the holy grail of a field biologist, is how to actually try and understand and observe that. And another one is culture. So we'll work actually a little backwards here. We'll work from right to left in terms of what we've been doing the last few years. So what do we mean by culture? Well, we can mean many things, so I have to be more specific. I don't mean this kind of culture, and I don't mean this kind of culture. What I do mean is something more like this. Cultural inheritance refers to the storage and transmission of information by communication, imitation, teaching, and learning. So really what I'm talking about here are cultural traditions and the value of cultural traditions. John Maynard Smith, the great evolutionary biologist, stated cultural inheritance is the most recent evolutionary transition in the history of life on Earth. So that's putting it sort of in perspective of how important culture can be even at an evolutionary level. And more recently, Luke Rendell and Hal Whitehead have applied these cultural concepts particularly to animals and especially non-primate species. And they redefine culture as information and behavior shared within a community, which is acquired by conspecifics through some sort of social learning. So we have the elements here for the rest of our talk. The idea of sharing of information within some kind of community through some form of social learning. And obviously, we're also looking at it in terms of it being an adaptive trait. There's value to culture in that respect. So to make it manageable, we decided to focus on one potential aspect of beluga whale behavior that may have a cultural aspect to it, and that's migration patterns. Do belugas have migratory culture? And there are several pieces that could basically contribute to culture. Animals would obviously have to be in some way social, and belugas certainly are. Undertake some kind of predictable or traditional seasonal migration. Ideally, there has to be some level of philopatry where basically you're not only coming back to the same area year after year, but maybe generation after generation. And finally, one conduit for social learning could be kinship, that you learn from your family members. And there are obviously advantages to that in terms of kin selection and inclusive fitness. So migratory culture, of course, is quite famous in our own cultures, in our own species. I very often go to meetings and conferences every year to the same place, meet the same people who make the migration north, exchange ideas, share information. I'm not saying there's a lot of kinship involved. Maybe there is, I don't know. And then there are obviously other species that we probably know quite well. For example, African elephants, where they undertake these large migrations, and the structure of those herds, we believe, is the key to how they learn these migration patterns. So with beluga whales, we think some of these elements. Like I said, they're gregarious. They form a diverse array of grouping patterns. Some form long-term associations. They're long-lived, by the way. They can live as long as 70, 80 years. There's a lot of social interactions, and they have very sophisticated communication systems, particularly at acoustic. They're known, as many of you are aware, the canaries of the sea. So we believe they form these communities. They may be quite complex societies, and we're sort of predicting there's a lot of social learning going on. So could we have the pieces in place that tell us there's culture in belugas? So, as I said, they undertake these seasonal migrations. They use these traditional submarine grounds. They come back to the same areas year after year, generation after generation. And they use the same routes through the ice and along shore. So much so that a lot of native culture over the centuries has developed around the predictability of these migrations, to show you how interwoven these two communities are. So one of the questions we wanted to know, was there site fidelity at the individual level? Were they actually the same individuals coming back? And potentially, was there philopatry? Was there an inheritance passing on because you were basically coming back to your place of birth? And so we did a series of genetic studies, and this is in fact what we found. There were these very discrete migration communities or populations of animals, and were demographically quite distinct. And we asked, well, if there is demographic independence, could this indicate migratory culture? So we looked at a number of populations throughout the Arctic. Here we're looking mainly in the North Pacific, Western Arctic, and all the little yellow dots are sampling areas, and all the shaded areas are the primary summer distributions and winter distributions. And the arrows are the sort of inferred migratory routes. And we've, over the years, acquired a lot of samples, and we've done a lot of satellite telemetry, and we've mapped these things out really with great detail. And we've been the lab that has done a lot of the genetic work. And basically what we found were these groups were indeed very, very distinct, not only at the mitochondrial level, but also at the nuclear level. So clearly both males and females were highly philopatric to their community or to their population. But what really nailed it for us was we found close relatives across years and even across decades return to the same location. So that's the piece we needed to basically prove that there was this sort of philopatry, this behavior that was being transmitted. And so when we combined that with what we knew about how discrete these migratory circuits were through a very heterogeneous but predictable environment, along with the fact that they're social and that we knew there was an extended period of maternal care, we proposed that indeed there is this migratory culture happening in beluga whales, where social learning, probably most likely among close kin, mom and offspring, is central to the inheritance of knowledge and behavior. And so that was a paper we published just a couple of years ago in PLOS ONE. And that set the stage for the next study, which was, so there you go, there's our little piece of the equation where we've tackled culture on the right. The next thing we want to do is look at what's on the left, which is something about social structure and kinship. Because what's interesting, and you may have caught this, is even though we found closely related individuals among years, we really still don't know a lot about actual social group dynamics and behavior in beluga whales. The assumption has long been that beluga social groups are kin-based, right? That most of the individuals, for example, in this herd or pod to the right are probably close relatives. And furthermore, they are probably close maternal relatives. And that has been pretty much the working hypothesis a lot of us have kind of labored under for decades, that beluga whales are essentially a matrilineal kin-based societies. And that has been informed by really exciting research on a lot of other species like sperm whales, elephants, killer whales, which are matrilineal. And there's a lot of benefits to structuring your societies around females, around mothers, grandmothers, daughters, granddaughters. If most of the individuals in your group are related, then through kin selection and inclusive fitness benefits, it's worth your while to cooperate and help your group members because they're related. So that influences group structure and cooperation. There may be leadership aspects to this. For example, some of these matrilineal societies are matriarchal, where an older female, certainly in elephants and killer whales, is a repository of a lot of information and knowledge, and sort of leads the social group. And so leadership is an aspect of it. And then obviously what we're interested in here, social learning and culture, can emerge if perhaps everybody is closely related and there's benefits to helping and sharing among other group members. And another very interesting element of this is the rare occurrence of something in nature, menopause, which has only been described in 5 species of vertebrate. And that includes obviously humans, ourselves, and a number of species of whales, pilot whales, killer whales, beluga whales, and narwhals. And a theory has emerged that for individual females to decide to have essentially a post-reproductive lifespan, it might be beneficial to work and live in a matrilineal society where it's worth your while to forgo any more reproduction in favor of helping your grandchildren through alloparental care. And in fact, this grandmother effect has been demonstrated in killer whales. So in all of that, belugas seem to really fit nicely into that model, but we didn't really know. So we set out to find out. And one of the first things we wanted to do was to find out how important is kinship in beluga whale societies. And we developed an international collaboration, and we partnered with a lot of native communities across the Arctic. And we studied belugas in 10 locations from Alaska to Canada, Norway to Russia. We observed these groups, and then we sampled the groups that we were observing. And we did that in many ways. We did it through a lot of our work on satellite telemetry. We worked in the field with hunters, and we collected a lot of skin samples that they generously provided. And we also went out in the field and we biopsied free swimming animals. And what we found was that, to our surprise, beluga whale social groupings, such as the one you see here, were comprised of kin and non-kin. So I've done a little kind of genetic network cartoon on the right and a real network on the left, which is basically linking very close individuals. And as you can see, there certainly are some closely related individuals based on the branches, but there are these other animals that are not related at all. So that was a bit of a surprise, and we just published that in July. That was actually a big surprise. We did find that when we looked at these groups of all adult males, very often they were not also comprised of closely related individuals, although there were indeed some relatives. And to us, that was very akin to coalitions of lions and chimpanzees, or alliances that have been seen in bottlenose dolphins, where maybe males are cooperating with non-kin through other mechanisms like mutualism and reciprocity. The other big finding was that these groups, and some were quite small, were not comprised of single matrilines. So we were like, well, what's really going on here? This kind of turns a lot of this a bit on its head. Then if they're not purely matrilineal, how big a force is kin selection? How is cooperation and group structure really emerging? And how particularly is social learning and culture developing? If some of the individuals in your group or in your community are definitely family members, but a lot are not. And that's kind of where we are right now. So we've kind of found out a few really cool things about belugas. It certainly shows they have very sophisticated societies. It certainly shows that they keep you on your toes, which is one of the things I love about beluga whales. But now we're going to get to what are we trying to do now? Well, John Burns, who has been working on belugas since the 70s, posed this question in 2019. Could culture be an obstacle to adaptation in a rapidly changing Arctic? And what we're worried about here is that, can you be hidebound essentially by culture, that you just keep doing the same thing because you've always done it, and these traditions are passed on immutable over time, and does that expose you to higher risk? And in fact, there might be some evidence for this in belugas, where there's a point source of a problem, they keep coming back year after year and facing the same risk. But of course, the flip side of that is, are belugas potentially cultural innovators? It's very tempting to liken a lot of this to human societies, where we have a lot of these cultures, but every now and then there's an innovator who changes something. And because we're social, it can spread like wildfire. So we're trying to tackle this question in a number of ways. They are just reiterated, beluga whales continue to use the same migration routes despite, this is just one extra little nugget that I think you'll find interesting. We conducted this really interesting exercise where we worked with native groups on traditional knowledge acquired over centuries of what beluga whales do. We worked with climate scientists, particularly people who look at sea ice, and we did the genetics. And we put a paper together where we basically found that beluga whales in a lot of cases continue to use the same migration routes despite dramatic annual differences in sea ice conditions. So there's maybe that predilection to keep doing what you're doing, or at least to persevere in getting to where you need to get to, no matter how difficult the journey is. But very interestingly, we did find a few anomalous cases where essentially the wrong whales turned up in the wrong place. And that was very exciting because sometimes nobody noticed it until we did the genetics and we said, you know, those aren't your whales. Those are somebody else's whales. And that coincided with these anomalous ice years, which sort of gives you an idea that maybe when things get to a point, you know, belugas can up sticks and do something else. So that's kind of a sort of a sweetener to where we want to go with our work. And so that's what I'm just going to kind of spend the last part of this talk on, is what is it we're trying to do now? I really think even though we've made all these great findings, we've only begun to really scratch the surface of beluga whale societies, their cultures, and how they acquire and share knowledge and behaviors. And then obviously how the ability to learn and maybe learn quickly is the first response in terms of resilience. That's the first thing we all do. If something's changed, you know, the first thing we adjust, you know, it isn't our genome, it isn't our physiology necessarily, it's our behavior. I think there's an increasing urgency to get at this issue of how Arctic mammals and mammals in general can adjust their behavior quickly and adjust their cultures and innovate and basically adapt in real time to emerging issues. And what I really would like to do is incorporate this understanding of learning and social learning and culture into effective management strategies. Management, you know, how would we use that to estimate risk? How would we use that to make management decisions? So we are now working with a lot of our long-standing collaborators in the native community to return once again to the north, to do more in-depth studies on some of the things we've done and some new studies. We want to continue our work on kinship and particularly affiliations among unrelated individuals. What's that all about, basically? We want to look more in detail at trade-offs animal makes between conflicts and cooperation. We want to look at this question of cultural conservatism versus innovation and the spread of new knowledge. You know, can new knowledge, like a contagion, spread rapidly through beluga communities, beluga networks? And then we want to look at social learning and risk assessments, like I said, to assist in management. And what's interesting about that is social learning and risk assessment and decision analysis is what people do every day. And it's actually what our friends in the north do all the time. And I think there's a really interesting connection between how native communities in the north adjust and adapt in similar ways to the very species that they have formed this really tight bond with. And I think that's where it gets really exciting. I thought I'd show you a video to give you just a sense of the gregarious and magnificent behavior. And this is thanks to National Geographic. And this is a place called Lancaster Sound in the Canadian High Arctic. And it's to this region we want to get to over the next coming years, as well as some other locations in Alaska. And you can see straight away that there's a lot going on here. There's animals of different sizes. They seem to be forming groups. There's a lot of interactions. There's a lot of touching. There's a lot of twisting and turning. But it's almost too much information. How do we tease apart what's actually going on in that group? And this is actually what the kind of bold new direction we're trying to go in is to understand the communication that's going on in these large herds and the learning opportunities. And if there are leaders and innovators in these communities that basically kind of instigate change. So we're applying a lot of the old tools. We're getting some new tools, and we're trying to get the most complete picture we can of beluga whale social behavior and some of their other behaviors in a very wild setting, which is very challenging to do. And as you can see here, we're using drones, and we're using underwater cameras and obviously hydrophones to record these animals, as well as traditional photography and observations. And one of the things we want to be able to do is see how they respond to novel stimuli. For example, the arrival of a new predator, the arrival of a ship, or some other potential novel stimulus that has a negative potentially effect, who knows. And we're working with an exciting team here at the College of Engineering and Computer Science at FAU, led by Hanqi Zhuang, where we're going to use their skills in artificial intelligence and machine learning to try and tease apart what's actually going on in these incredible aggregations of beluga whales. And we're currently at a point where we're trying to basically gather support, and we've been very fortunate with some of the support we've already had, and not just from our colleagues and friends in the north, but we recently got a National Geographic Explorer grant. We're very excited about that. And these are some of the other agencies and groups that we're working with, and some we've applied for funding for. And I'm sure this collection of potential funders will grow. And so we're very thankful that we're being considered or we're being assisted already from a really wonderful group of supporters. And just yesterday, Florida Atlantic University launched a new crowdfunding site, Life on the Edge, and there's some information here where you can access it. And I want to thank Amanda, Tesha, Cara, and Megan for putting this together. And there's some nice little videos you can see there on what we do, and it explains a little more. So we really are thankful. Every little bit helps. And I do want to thank an incredible team I've had over the years of very dedicated people who go out in the field and work hard in the lab. And then funders from all across the world who have supported a lot of this research. And I would just like to leave you with this. And basically, you know, whatever the technology is that we've used, whether it's genetics or drones, it's been really fantastic. But at the end of the day, it's just about spending time with whales in their environment. And just getting there and being in the presence of whales, I think, is really how we're going to crack a lot of these questions. And so I thank you, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. That was very interesting. Looks very cold too. So you mentioned the technologies that you're using to study the animals. One of the questions that one of our attendees had was whether you're tagging these animals.
Yes. So I could go on and on about some of the satellite tagging work we've done. So one of the issues was, for a long time, Native communities had gathered a lot of information on when whales arrive and when they leave, and mainly their coastal behavior. But they were intrigued to know, well, where do they go when they go offshore? And then they really instigated a lot of this work where, when the whales come to shore, we will catch a few with you, we will let you put tags on them. And then these satellite tags have given us a continuous story, not only of where they go, but how deep they dive. And so we have this treasure trove of information, and some of that tagging work is going to continue. So yeah, there's a lot of exciting work we could share with people on that.
Great. How long do you usually follow a whale that is tagged? So
in the early years, if we got a few months, we were happy. It was everything that we learned was a surprise. I'd say working with belugas is very humbling, because most of your predictions, usually the whale does something even more incredible than you could have imagined. But now we're trying to get an entire year of data, where they go in the winter, the summer, how deep they dive. Another thing we found that was really exciting was because we would see them close to shore and see them sometimes in these shallow Arctic seas like the Bering Sea, it was very shallow, in the Chukchi Sea. We somehow thought, oh, they're shallow divers. They just kind of stay close to the surface. Well, obviously, when they went offshore, these guys dove to like 3,000 feet, no problem. And so it's just very exciting and very humbling to realize, God, I don't really know this animal at all. Like,
very interesting. That's the advantage of newer technologies, I guess. Just as a reminder, if you have any questions, please hover your mouse on the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A button there. If you click that, you can type your questions there. Okay, I have a completely different question about a different animal, the white polar bear. The question here is whether they're actually black and their hair is just translucent.
That person knows their stuff. Their skin is black. They are correct. And actually, we have a very exciting study right now working on polar bears. Tatiana Ferrer in my lab is leading this study where we are using, and this is very cool, hair collected in large part by native hunters who have set up these hair traps, hair snares, to kind of genotype these animals and track their behavior. So that's working out. It's very challenging, but it's working out.
So their skin is black and their hair is translucent?
That's true.
Oh, very interesting. I didn't know that. Does this research move policy to protect these creatures, the beluga whales now? Back to them.
That's a very good question. A lot of my earlier career was really very focused on policy. Identifying stocks, for example. That's a no-brainer. Is this group of whales different to this group of whales? And so a lot of that early work was about identifying management units, and that went straight to policy. But what's really exciting now is we're taking that work and we're trying to shape policy thinking. And so it's very applied work, even though it sounds quite esoteric. It's going to go to, helping an entire community of scientists and natives figure out what is important habitat, protecting habitat. But as an example, how vulnerable are belugas to shipping? We know there's a very recent study done by Donna Hauser showing that there's projected to be a really huge increasing in shipping. So we would love to work with people where we can kind of design these studies around impacts directly on behavior from new human activities.
And there's actually, you're talking about shipping. There is actually a related question here. How vulnerable do you think belugas are to the increase in shipping with the opening of the Northwest Passage?
So this is a major concern in communities across the Arctic. Kind of out of sight, out of mind for a lot of us, but there really is a dramatic increase in shipping, and certainly projected to continue in the Northern Sea Route as well as the Northwest Passage. And a lot of communities are very concerned about how shipping might even influence prey distribution as well as whale distribution and what have you. And we know whales are vulnerable certainly to sound and disturbance. But one thing about belugas is there are instances where, given the time, there's certain activities humans have conducted, like fishing in some parts, where they've adapted to where the fisheries is, where the fishing boats are, even where the nets are. So it's like this thing where these animals are adaptable. Like, don't give up on them. They are very tough. They're very resilient. But give them some time is one issue, obviously. And I mean, I certainly want to maintain these areas as pristine as possible. But I think it's a question of time. How quick can they adapt?
How quick can they adapt? Yeah. Very interesting. I guess that's true for most cultures, I would argue,
Sure.
right? I mean, who can just change their behaviors on the spot? Coming back to, you showed these relationships in the groups of the belugas where you were surprised that they're not all related, actually. The question here is, how do you know that? How do you know whether the beluga whales are related or not?
Oh, good question. So what we'd be able to do is we would sit and observe a group of whales, or there might be a group of whales that native hunters collected samples from or whatever. But if we observe these whales, then we would try and sample them. And then we would basically genetically fingerprint them. And so we could very quickly say, oh, you know, this one is a sibling or this one is a parent. And then you would get this guy and you're like, whoa, I mean, who's this guy? He's just not related. So we're trying to even resolve the power of our genetics to tell second and third order relatives apart. So that's actually what we're doing right now is, can we tell a great uncle from a completely unrelated individual?
Very interesting. A somewhat related question, which is very complex, where our attendee is asking how this could be translated to human behavior. So you talked about the matrilineal cultures and how that benefits the entire family and species. And the first question here is if humans have that as well.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting, because a lot of traditional native cultures around the world are matrilineal and matriarchal. And interestingly, a lot of northern and Arctic native communities have a very strong matriarchy to structure. And so, like so many things in the Arctic, when you explain your results, they always go, yeah, we know that. That's not and it's very humbling. Where I think it gets really interesting is native peoples have, and I think I'm using the word correctly, a kinship with the animals they rely on. And I think we all thought that was in terms of, oh, well, you know, they understand them because they use them or they need them. And I think it is, no, they are very similar. And, you know, science is just kind of catching up. It's kind of dawning on us that, you know, they identify with these animals and have, and they love that we can fill in the blanks. You know, there are obviously many benefits, back to the other part of the question, to forming groups among close relatives, especially if it's female, because females do a lot of the rearing of and care. So you have alloparental care and things like that. But they become these repositories of incredibly important information. And so, because it's important to the survival of their offspring and their grand offspring. One thing that was kind of cool about belugas was males weren't completely feckless. Like, they were present. They were in these groups. They stayed in these communities, and they swam around with a lot of relatives as well. And so it's almost like, hey, you know, maybe the males are somehow carrying some of the burden. And so that's an intriguing aspect to this too.
Very interesting. So the follow-up that our attendee has to that is, as we're humans are having a higher rate of non-nuclear families, do you expect that our species will go into a decline because of that?
Ooh, wow. That's a fantastic question. Here's what I think from maybe an evolutionary standpoint, I am actually at the precipice of is I have been brought up in the tradition of kind of Darwinian explanations for social structure, and particularly the brilliant insight that Hamilton had with kin selection. You know, that even though selection's acting on the individual, you contribute to the group because they're related to you. But looking at belugas, I think we might be dealing with societies where there might be a lot of close affiliations among unrelated individuals. There might be a lot of cooperation about unrelated individuals. So maybe to that person's point, no, I don't think that's necessarily a concern. I think we all contribute to community, maybe not selflessly, but sometimes there's benefits we receive in return, you know? So sometimes we have situations where people will defend something without expecting somebody else to do them a favor. It's just if everybody defends it, we all win. And so I think the non-kin elements of these societies is actually really, really exciting.
Yes, and do you have any indication how the non-kin come to swim with a certain group? How do they associate
That is
with each
exactly
other?
what we're now. Thank you. You teed that up beautifully. That's what we want to do. Working with Hanshi and his group is why are these guys hanging out together? Like, and how do they meet? And one of the things I see when I look at belugas in the field, especially in these aggregation areas, it's like a zoo. Like the animals are moving all over the place. And so even though Young is staying close to his mom, he's off socializing with all his mates. And so you're kind of like, maybe these bonds happen very early on. And it could be, you're right, that these long-term affiliations work based on you help me, I help you. That's certainly true. But who knows? Maybe they just like hanging out together.
I'm looking forward to hearing your explanation in a few years on that one.
Yeah.
Okay, another question here. Last summer, I visited Alaska, not me, unfortunately. We were told that the habitat of some whales is so specific to them that as the waters are warming and their normal food source is diminishing, they are starving rather than changing their diets. How common is this type of behavior?
Wow. Well, that is a growing concern, is this ability of these animals. It's almost like we're backing animals into a corner and we need to give them an escape route. We need to let them, because I do think animals are resilient. It's just if you keep blocking off their exit. But I do think to the question of why aren't they adjusting, I think this is where the cultural component of this can come in. I don't think it's necessarily because they are so specialized. The famous cheetah example where the cheetah has to hunt a very specific, narrow prey base. I think some of these whales may have a more diverse suite of options. It's just, do they innovate, and who's the innovator? So that's a very pertinent question.
What is the main cause of death for belugas?
Ooh. I really don't know, to be very honest with you, because I think a lot of whales may die far from shore. But one thing I will say, which is back to this issue of social conservatism and the dangers, maybe, sorry, not social, the dangers of being a social species. One really amazing cause of death with belugas is what they call ice entrapments. And it happens narwhals too, where belugas may linger in a place where the ice forms rapidly, unusually rapidly, and they get cut off. And there's been cases documented where thousands of whales have perished. We know they're preyed upon by polar bears, we know they're preyed upon by killer whales, but how important that is, and in most cases, the native reliance on whales is quite small.
Coming back to the social behavior and the groups that they are forming with the kin and non-kin, once the non-kin and the kin group has formed, do they always stay together? You mentioned earlier you may have a young one that goes out here and goes out there, hangs with their mates, hangs with their family once in a while. So is it always the same group that eventually stays together, or do they mix up?
I don't think so. I think it's quite flexible. And I think what's going on is, on a much larger scale, whales are born into their community population, and they tend to stay. And these populations could be hundreds, thousands of animals. So they are community members. They form a range of grouping patterns that I think are dependent on the social context and the ecological context. So you have this fission-fusion dynamics maybe that's going on, which makes it very hard to kind of figure out what's happening. But there may be individuals that have long-term affiliations. And some of those could be kin. I'm not excluding the fact that there may be some matrilineal element to some of their behavior. But even on a daily basis, belugas are totally at ease with saying, okay, guys, I'll see you later. I'm going off with this group to do this. Very fluid.
Yeah. Okay, coming back to something you said earlier, where you mentioned you're looking at the genetics of the whales. How do you biopsy the animals to determine their kinship?
So what we do is very exciting in many ways. We want to be as unobtrusive as possible. And so we use these crossbows with these little darts that have a float on them. And at the end, they have a little corer that takes a skin sample about the size of a pencil eraser. And I tell you, the first time I did this, I thought, I'm going to hit a whale and the whole bay is going to clear out. And that's going to be the end. So it was with trepidation. And what tends to happen is they kind of look around and they hit the other whale and go, did you just bite me? And they kind of get on with what they're doing. And so fortunately, most of the time, they don't even know they've been nicked. And so that's mainly how we do it. Some people use an air rifle, you know, we use a crossbow.
Very interesting. We're almost out of time. I want to finish with one last question for you, Greg, online, but I know we haven't answered everybody's questions. So we're going to ask you to offline answer the remaining questions, and we're going to post that on our website together with a recording of Greg's talk and also the link to the crowdfunding website. So the last question is, what can we do here in Florida to help the environment in the Arctic?
Thank you so much for that question. I think a huge part of it is raising awareness that what happens in the Arctic today happens in the rest of the planet tomorrow. That in one way, it is a salient lesson and classroom for us. And so as we see the impacts of warming temperatures and the loss of sea ice and see how that reverberates throughout communities, it's a reminder that, you know, this is coming, this is happening, we have to prepare. But also a lot of public pressure on your political leaders to do what you believe is right to protect some of these areas is the most powerful, you know, in terms of, you know, contacting your congressman or the ballot box or what have you. I think if you make it an important issue, the leaders, ironically, will follow.
Great. Thank you very much, Greg. Again, we will post the recording and the answers to the remaining questions on our website. With that, I thank you very much. And for our attendees, I hope to see you next week again. Have a great
Thank you all very much for attending. And thank you, Karen. Take care, everybody.
You too. Bye-bye.